In the desolate expanses of hell's ancient wilderness, the hunters of the left-hand path serve the enigmatic court of the seven-headed serpent. These solitary figures navigate hidden ley lines connecting forgotten shrines, performing dark rituals that transform their arms into formidable weapons, often resembling bows that launch arrows forged from their own tainted blood. While their allegiance to the Hell's Lords is tenuous, their unparalleled mastery of dark arts and unerring precision make them formidable adversaries, seamlessly navigating the war-torn landscapes of both their infernal homeland and the mortal realm. Hey guys, welcome back to the next episode in my Trench Crusade painting series. And this time it's the Hunter of the Left-Hand Path, which is the first model I'm going to be tackling from the Court of the Seven-Headed Serpent. And I've been looking forward to painting this model for quite some time, as I think it's one of the harder models in the range. So let's see what we can do with it. And the first step in the process is to prime the model with black primer. And in my case I used Colourforge Matte Black. And the next part of the process is to begin painting up the cape. And for that I use Citadel Pallid Witch Flesh. And I'm going to use this to paint in all of the outer parts of the cloak, excluding all of the inner intestines. And for this I did use an airbrush, but it's really up to you, as you could just as easily go in with a paintbrush. I just used the airbrush for speed. And once that was done, I then went in with some Army Painter Pink Potion and used this for all of the intestinal parts. And by going in with this slightly darker pink colour, we'll start to delineate the difference between the outer and inner parts of the cloak. And again, I did use an airbrush for this part, but if you wanted, you could just go in with a brush as well. And then after touching up all of the overspray on all of the black areas, I then decided to come in with a 50-50 mix of Caraborg Crimson and Druchii Violet, and use this to apply a wash to the entire cape. And I did thin this wash with a 1:1 ratio of water, and then applied this to the inner intestinal parts of the cloak, making sure I wick up any excess pooling that's occurring at the bottom parts of the model. And once that was done, I then added a few more drops of water to the remaining mixture, just to thin it down even more, and then applied this thinned down mixture to all of the outer parts of the cloak. And the reason for this is I don't want it to tint the outer part of the cloak quite as much as the inner part. And this should just help make the wash flow over all of the flat surfaces and into all of the recesses. And once that had all dried, I then went back in with the same Pallid Witch Flesh, which I used to paint in the outer part of the cloak, and just use this to re-establish all of the highlights on the outer part of the cloak. And as I said, this is just going to be a very light dry brush, and it should just catch all of the raised edges. I then went in with some Army Painter Gunmetal and just used this to apply a quick dry brush highlight to all of the black armour panels. And as I've mentioned before, when dry brushing metallics, you want to be extra light with the amount of paint you use on the tip of your brush, as the metallics can be a little bit overpowering when dry brushing. So just start off light and build it up from there. Next up, I used Army Painter Skeleton Bone and Leather Brown, using the skeleton bone to paint in both of the skulls on the front and back of the model. And then just coming in with the Leather Brown to paint in all of the straps in and around the skulls. Next I went back in again with some pallid witch flesh and used this to paint in all of the whites for the eyeballs that are on the inner part of the cloak. And if you clicked on this video hoping to learn how to paint eyeballs, I'm sorry to disappoint, because I decided to cheat and use some eyeball transfers that I saw on eBay, which are available in a whole manner of sizes and styles, and it was something I was really curious about if it could work with miniature painting. And for the most part I was pretty happy with them. You just have to remove the transfer and get it onto the part of the miniature you want, like any other standard transfer. However, I did notice that these were slightly thicker than usual, so they were slightly more difficult to adhere to the spherical surface of the eyeball. But with a little bit of persistence and some micro sol, the transfer eventually adhered to the surface. And for the smaller eyeballs, I just trimmed the transfer down to fit the size of the eyeball, which worked in some cases better than others, and might have been better if I got the smaller sizes for these smaller eyeballs. But I just worked with the transfers that I had and trimmed them down. But in the future I'm definitely going to try these out on another project, now that I've used them and have a better idea of how to apply them. Next up I'm going to be using Mr. Weathering Multiblack pigment, which is just a pre-thinned down oil wash. And I'm going to thin it down even more using some odourless white spirits at a ratio of 1:1 white spirits to the multi-black pigment. And I'm just going to apply this over the entire model, allowing it to flow into all of the recesses. And on a side note, I did apply some satin varnish to the entire model before applying this oil wash. And this will just help to protect all of the paint when it comes to the removal process. And if you don't have the Mr. Weathering Multi-Black pigment or can't get a hold of it in your country, then honestly any black oil or enamel wash would do for this, and that includes mixing your own black oil wash from some oil paints as well. And try to avoid using acrylic products like Nuln Oil or Army Painter Strong Tone. as these don't have the same flow properties and drying properties of the oil and enamel washes, so won't quite give you the same effect in the end. And similarly with this wash, I'm going to apply this first mixture to the front part of the model, including all the intestine areas and all of the armour. And when it comes to the back of the cape, I'm going to add a few more drops of the white spirits to thin down the remainder of the oil wash even further. And then just use this to apply all over the back of the cape. Again, I'm doing this as I don't want the back of the cape to be tinted quite as much as the front. And once that had dried to the touch, which takes around 20 minutes or so, I then come in with some makeup sponges and wipe away all of the excess oil wash from all of the raised and upward facing surfaces. And at this stage the oil wash should just wipe off without too much issue. But if you did leave it a little bit longer and the wash is not getting removed, you can just dip the makeup sponge in a little bit of white spirits, which will help reactivate the oil wash and allow it to be removed more easily. And once that was done, I then went back in with the pallid witch flesh and reapplied a dry brush highlight to the back part of the cloak. And again, this will just help re-establish the highlights that were dulled down by the oil wash. I'm then going to use some Army Painter gunmetal to do exactly the same thing to all of the metallic areas by reapplying a dry brush highlight, which should just re-establish the highlights and bring back that metallic look. I'm then going to come in with some Villainy inks carrying crimson, and I'm just going to use this to start to build up some of the gore effects on all of the internal parts of the cape. And this is going to include all of the intestines, and I'm also going to apply this to the skulls, the bow, and also the hands and feet of the model. And I just used an old frayed brush for this and stippled this on to all of the areas, which should help intensify the colour in these areas and also add a little bit of texture due to the carrion crimson having some large pigments running throughout it. And once that had dried, I then went back in with some Army Painter Pink Potion, which was the original colour I used to paint the internals of the cloak, and just use this to apply a very light dry brush to all of the intestinal internal areas. And again, just doing this to re-establish some of the highlights lost from all of the oil and enamel washes. Next, I'm going to go in with some Army Painter True Blood and Dry Blood, and I'm going to use these to stipple on to certain areas that I want to be extra bloody, and that's going to be areas like the two skulls on the front and back of the model, and also the blade of the weapon and the arrow from the bow, and also the hands and feet as well. And after that was done, I then got the model attached to its base in preparation for the last step, which was to go in with some dirty down Gore. And I'm just going to use this to apply a few strands of Gore to the blade of the weapon and also the arrow of the bowhand. And once that was done, the model is now complete, and I'm ready to move on to the next model, which is going to be a model voted on by my Patreon subscribers, who I'm very grateful to and who help support this channel, so thank you very much. And if you want to help support the channel, I'll leave a link to my Patreon and affiliates in the description down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.